Well, welcome. I'm Gretchen Sable, President of League of Women Voters ABC, and thank you for joining us today for this program. We're going to be talking with Allie Schmitz. She's a wildlife manager, North Metro wildlife manager with the Minnesota DNR. Her offices are up at Carlos Avery Wildlife Refuge. We were able to get this program because I had had some issues with coyotes in my yard. I live in Andover, and there's coyotes all around me. I walked out my door an evening last week and I could hear them singing on three sides of me. And I thought, holy crap, how many coyotes are in this area? And then yesterday I read in the paper that was probably just three coyotes making a variety of sounds to claim their territory from other coyotes. So, okay, well, that was good to know. And then I have another kind of predator living under my deck right now, a possum living under my deck. The possums killed all my chickens a few years ago, so I know they're predators too. So, here in Anoka County, we have so much wild area. We have Carlos Avery, we have the Cedar Creek natural area up there that the U has in northeastern Anoka County. There's big county parks that have lots of open spaces. Cities have open spaces. There's farms. There's people with big lots. These creatures are all around, and I just had a lot of curiosity about it. So we're going to have Allie talk to us about the living with the predators around us. So with that, I'll toss it off to Allie, and she can tell us something about herself and then get talking on the animals. Thanks.
Thanks, Gretchen. Thanks for having me today, everyone. My name's Allie. I am a wildlife manager for the Minnesota DNR and out of the North Metro office. My team and I are based out of Carlos Avery WMA, located in Anoka County. So today we'll talk about some of the wildlife and the predatory mammalian species and birds of prey that you might find in Anoka County. I have been with the DNR since 2019, and I spent the first 5 years as a state park ranger prior to working now as a wildlife biologist. So I will pull up
Good morning.
my
Hello.
presentation. Great. So we're here to talk about wildlife predators in Anoka County. So where do I work? I mentioned with my team, here's a zoomed in map of our North Metro area. We actually cover Hennepin, Ramsey, Anoka, and Washington County. So within the yellow boundaries that you see, the blue areas are actually WMAs. So we have 7 wildlife management areas within Anoka County. Carlos Avery WMA being the biggest at about 25,000 acres. Some of the other names you may have heard in the county in the area are Bethel WMA, Bonnell, Gordy Mickelson, Lamprey Pass, Mallard Marsh, and Berman WMA. That's about 20,000 acres total of public land in state wildlife management areas in Anoka County. So that's pretty special, as Gretchen led to point out. That means there's a lot of wildlife in the area. And as urban sprawl and development expands, many of these wildlife species find themselves in residential lots or yards or in the nearby parks and traveling through those areas. So mammalian carnivores of Minnesota, here's a nice long list. They're found all over the state, and we will not talk about all of them today because they're not all located in Anoka County. But some very important wildlife that you're likely aware of or have heard of before. Black bear, bobcat, cougar passing through, coyote, fisher, raccoons, river otters, minks, marten. There's a whole long list to talk about. So next we'll just discuss quickly predator versus prey in that relationship. So a predator can be a carnivore or an omnivore, and that means it's an animal that survives by hunting, killing, and consuming other animals, which are prey, for food and energy. So a prey animal would typically be an herbivore, so something that eats plant matter and vegetation, and they are hunted and killed and consumed by predators. So some of those species that were just listed on the previous page are carnivores and omnivores. So black bears are an omnivore, but things like bald eagle are a true carnivore and feeding on small rodents and fish and things like that. So, not all predators are strict carnivores, as I mentioned, and many actually have a variety of things that make up their diet, making them the omnivore that we discussed, eating plants, vegetation matter, and meats of other animals. One thing to mention would also be scavengers who do consume other animals and wildlife species.
Oh, okay.
However, they will also feed on animals that are dead that they find, which is where they get the name of scavenger. So, first one to talk about, like Gretchen led into, that's kind of how we started our conversation and how she connected with our office. We talked to a lot of people about coyotes. It is the most abundant large predator in the state. So, we get a number of phone calls all the time about coyote sightings, or maybe you hear them howling, as Gretchen mentioned. So they tend to prey on small mammals, but sometimes they can kill large mammals or livestock. They weigh in about 25 to 30 pounds. They can resemble a small German Shepherd. They have a bottle-shaped tail. Their fur is very long, it's coarse and heavy. The photograph here on my presentation was sent to us by the public. So this individual had sent a photo just asking for an identification. You know, people do wonder very often, wolf versus coyote. So coyote is much smaller than a wolf. However, you can see the winter coat in this photograph. So I would consider this an urban coyote, pictured earlier this winter, and you can see how dense and fluffy that fur is. It does oftentimes lead them to look a little bit bigger than they actually are. Gretchen mentioned in her intro that coyotes are very vocal, so we'll hear them howling or barking alone or in groups. The yipping is a very key identifying factor of a coyote, and maybe a den being nearby or just them communicating to other groups. They have higher pitched voices, the younger coyotes do. So they're shaggy and grayish coat, white at the throat and belly. So, population and management, what's going on with coyotes? Well, they're abundant in Anoka County as well as the rest of the state, and their populations are growing throughout the metro area. So, densities can vary from one coyote every 3 miles to high population years for one coyote to every 5 or 6 miles during lower population years. So, you can see the range map on the slide there. It does cover the entire state. Coyotes can be harvested by hunting and trapping, and in Minnesota, roughly about 4,000 are shot or trapped each year. Coyotes were once common in Minnesota's prairies, but are more rare now throughout the northern forests. After widespread logging and fire created better habitat for small mammals, coyotes began to extend their range again. Due to intensive agriculture, their numbers dwindled on the prairies. But in recent years, coyotes appear to be increasing once again with better access to some of those smaller mammals that now inhabit agricultural fields or converted farming fields in restorations. Coyotes begin to mate at age 2. Mating season begins in January and lasts through about February. So we typically see an uptick in phone calls around that time, whether it's more vocalizations, um, more interactions, maybe with the public. Most commonly, it has to do with an interaction between a coyote and a dog. So that's pretty common, especially when and if a dog is off leash, especially in parks, or large public green spaces like golf courses. That's where we get a lot of those interactions reported to us. So after breeding, females search for dens, digging one up in loose soil or enlarging the den of another mammal that already exists. And coyotes are nomads. The males roam over territories as large as 36 square miles. And females usually stay within a 6 square mile area, but they can move 2 to 3 miles a day. So, although coyotes can be found anywhere in Minnesota, distribution and population sizes vary. We just discussed how they are expanding within the metro area. Now, this species is unprotected in Minnesota and may be taken at any time by shooting and trapping. Unprotected means there's no legal season. So, if you have a coyote problem on your property, legally you can remove that coyote any time of year without a hunting or trapping license. It's also important to know that the DNR does not trap, shoot, or relocate coyotes. So a lot of times that's what we get phone calls about, but we're unable to perform those activities due to volume and liability as well. We don't have a big enough wildlife staff to be doing trapping and relocating of wildlife. Some tips and tricks for living with wildlife that can be very important. Securing all your garbage containers, your wildlife feeders, and other food sources to prevent coyote from access. Confining small dogs and cats in kennels or supervising them when they're outside is the safest option. You can also vaccinate pets for rabies, distemper, parvo, and other diseases as recommended by a vet. And you can also harass by chasing, shouting, spraying with a water hose, blowing an air horn at coyotes that do not immediately run from people. It just means they might have found something that they're interested in, or they've caught the scent of an odor that they think is a food source. So you don't want to let them get habituated. And some other reminders: do not feed coyotes, do not leave pet food outside, and do not allow cats and small dogs outside unattended if there are coyotes in the area. Usually, these suggestions help prevent any conflict between humans and coyotes, but when and if depredation occurs, sometimes aggressive coyote have to be removed from the area. So next up, we can talk about black bear. So black bears are the only species of bear in the state of Minnesota. And our department and our Division of Wildlife like to say, if you live in Minnesota, you do live in bear country. So just in general, 5 to 6 feet long. Their weight varies quite a bit. They can be 150 pounds from a female up to 500 or more as a large male. So they're going to be that dark color, black, brown, or light brown, but we don't see too much of that fur variation in Minnesota. Now, they feed on vegetation in spring, turning to ants and insects in the summer and June, and a variety of berries as well as plants fruit and primarily nuts like acorns in autumn. So a large black bear has a large head, small eyes, erect ears, and a very short black tail. They have reasonable hearing and exceptionally keen sense of smell. It's actually better than a dog. They are typically restricted to forested areas, and I'll show a map of their range shortly, but they do follow their noses and use a mental map of where on the landscape they have found food sources previously. So their food sources remain in a constant state of flux from season to season and year to year. So if you end up hearing a bear nearby in the woods or the forest, they make a lot of huffing noises, snorting, jaw popping sounds when they're nervous or distressed, and they try and repel intruders. Cubs make a humming noise when nursing and squealing when frightened or uncomfortable, maybe in a den out in the woods. For bears, they don't have many predators, potentially wolves. While they're hibernating, they might find a den, or people who hunt bear for their meat and fur in Minnesota. Bears live in forests, swamps, and other areas with dense cover, but they also venture into clearings to feed. There's about 13,000 to 18,000 black bears in Minnesota, and sport hunting and vehicle collisions are the main source of mortality. Bear hunters tend to harvest about 2,300 black bears in the last 10 years. That was the average. And they can consume 12,000 to 20,000 calories a day to prepare for hibernation. So they range from the northern third of the state as far south as the interface between the forest and the agricultural zone. So they do utilize corn and other crops for sustenance. Bear hunting licenses are restricted by our department to manage that population and keep them healthy. They do have delayed implantation. So when do bears breed? Typically in the spring, but the fertilized egg implants in November, and the mother will have the newborn cubs typically in January during the denning season. So newborns don't hibernate, but they get all the nourishment they need from their mother in that first winter in the den. They typically have cubs. The average litter size for Minnesota is 3, and they have them by mid-March. They weigh 5 to 6 pounds in the beginning. Then they'll usually leave the den for the first time around April, and they'll remain with the mother for about 17 months. So what we call a yearling will stay with their mom through that first denning season after they are 1 year old. So some reminders about living with wildlife in case you do see a bear or you have a bear visiting your property. This is another thing we get called about quite often. They usually try to avoid people, but sometimes we come in conflict with humans when they eat crops, destroy apiaries because they want some honey, or they break into garbage cans and bird feeders. Once a bear finds food on your property, it will likely return. Repeated access to food can teach bears to associate homes with a food source and erode the bear's natural instinct to avoid people because it finds that easy meal. So the best option is to remove that attractant. So some reminders what to do: remove bird feeders in the spring. If you persist in feeding birds during the summer, you can remove the suet or the seed in hummingbird feeders at night. You can also hang bird feeders about 10 feet off the ground and 10 to 12 feet away from other trees. That usually makes them out of reach for bears. A reminder to store your trash in a secure area, such as a sturdy shed or garage, and put it out the morning of garbage pickup instead of the night before. You can also request or ask your service carrier about bear-proof garbage cans and see if they have any options. You can reduce odors by washing your garbage cans and removing any food or scrap residue that may interest bear and attract them in the first place. And we also have some additional tips about composting. So if you are putting food scraps in your compost, try to always cover that layer with your brown duff layer of dried leaves or your fresh grass clippings. That way it kind of masks the odor of the food that you're putting in that may be a little bit less attractive to bear. If you have gardens, which is very common, or fruiting trees, try and pick up and remove ripe fruit from the trees in the garden and surrounding your grounds. If that is not an option, or if you have an apiary and you want to protect it, we have forest biologists and researchers who have been studying energized fencing, and the results are promising to keep bear away from that bird feeder or that garden once they learn that the fence is energized. So they're pretty smart. And just a reminder to don't ever feed bears because that's what teaches them to associate you or your property with an easy food source. Feeding bears can create conflict, and bears may have to be removed or killed if they do become habituated to an easy food source that's on private property. And a reminder to never leave pet food outside, as discussed with coyote as well. That results in another attractant. So on to our next predatory mammalian species would be bobcat in the area. This would be the most common of the native wildcat species for Minnesota and especially in Anoka County. The other two would be a cougar or a mountain lion in the common name, or the Canadian lynx, which is only found way up north in the arrowhead of the state. So this animal has a very short bobbed tail, which is where it gets its name, light brown, gray fur on the top, and often with spots on the belly and the legs. About 2,000 bobcats live in Minnesota. That's the current population estimate. Bobcat eat a wide range of small and medium-sized prey, including mice, hares, squirrels, birds, and sometimes fawns of white-tailed deer. Baby bobcats are usually born during late March through May in a litter of 2 to 4 kittens, and sometimes they're born as late as September. Bobcat can kill an adult deer by pouncing from a tree onto the deer's neck from an overhanging limb and piercing its jugular vein. So it does have the ability to take down large prey species, but it's not extremely common. Other predatory species of the bobcat, such as fisher and coyote, may compete for the same food sources and kill a bobcat. But a bobcat may also be able to fight back and kill a fisher or coyote given the chance. So they're definitely equal in the ecosystem out there as predatory species and also overlapping on food sources. So they're about 26 to 36 inches long, and the tail's usually about 4 to 7 inches. The females weigh 20 to 25 pounds, and a male might be 30 pounds. So that's how you can identify them. Tall, erect, pointy ears, and that short tail is really its defining characteristic. Population and range about bobcat, they certainly are in Anoka County. They appear to be more adaptable to changing land use than the more reclusive lynx. So we do not see the lynx range expanding, but we do see some shifts going on with the bobcat range in a positive way, seeing more expansion down into the southern portion of the state. They prefer habitat with a lot of prey, such as young aspen forests and cedar swamps, where deer tend to congregate in winter months. So they are most common in the woodlands of north central and the northeastern counties of the state. And the population is stable. It's a valuable fur bearer, so it is trapped and hunted. Hunting methods do typically use hounds or opportunistically, and they're hunted and trapped for its fur, which can be valuable. So it is a fur bearer species in the state of Minnesota. And if you do take a bobcat, there's a legal season with a legal license, and you have to come register your pelt with the Minnesota DNR out of my wildlife office or another one. Just another fun one to think of that sometimes people might see in the water or scampering along some shorelines of the rivers or lakes, and you might see a brown flash and say, hey, what was that? Beaver versus otter, you got to see that tail to make a big distinction, but otter are also much more athletic and maneuverable. So they're the largest aquatic carnivore we have in Minnesota, living in most of our lakes, ponds, and streams. And they're also very busy and they have tireless travels, so they can range 25 miles in a single week. So it may not be there the following week when you go to look, or we have people call us who have never seen one the whole time they've lived in Minnesota for 25 or 35 years, and then one day there it is. So they are always almost on the move and busy doing something. Um, Otters are also a fur bearer species in the state, so about 2,000 are trapped each year, and their estimated population is about 12,000. So they range statewide from top to bottom of Minnesota, and they're perfectly suited for their ecosystem and habitat. And living an aquatic lifestyle. They're long and sleek with short legs, with webbed feet, and a long tail. Their fur is deep brown and it's very short and dense, which keeps them warm in our cooler waters. Adult river otters are about 4 to 5.5 feet long, including about an 18-inch tail. The adults can weigh about 30 pounds, and 15 to 19, 20 pounds is pretty average. So they prey on all different kinds of fish and aquatic species. They maneuver through the water and they usually swim with their head above water. And they have a long period of delayed implantation, as I mentioned with bear as well, for reproduction. So after adult females have a litter of 1 to 5 young, they breed and become pregnant again for almost a full year. So their food sources are a variety of small aquatic organisms like fish, clams, muskrats, and turtles. And they can also catch terrestrial mammals like chipmunks, mice, and young rabbits. So very few predators can catch a otter while it is in the water. However, on land, otters can be killed by bobcat, coyote, and wolves. So we could not finish off today's conversation without talking about raptors of the Midwest. So of course we have birds of prey, much different than, your average songbird species, but they do play a very big role in the ecosystem. So some may be true carnivores, like we'll talk about the bald eagle next, while others fall into that scavenger category, like the turkey vulture listed here. So birds of prey make up a big part of the ecosystem throughout the Midwest, and this is a very long list of birds of prey that you can find throughout the Midwest and Minnesota. And the Raptor Center with University of Minnesota does fantastic work with many of these species. So, as I mentioned, we'll just talk about one of the biggest birds of prey here with the bald eagle, having a wingspan of about 6.5 to 8 feet in length. So, they start out as molted brown and white dark bodies when they're young, and they reach their adult plumage around 5 years old with that yellow beak, white head, white tail, and a dark brown body. The accumulation of DDT in their food chain, largely through aquatic species, was the primary reason that the population was declining all over the country back in the 1970s. After the elimination of that, we started to observe an increase in population and better healthy breeding populations. So that population throughout the US has been studied for a very long time, and luckily we were able to address those environmental concerns that were causing a decline in this specific bird of prey. However, those things also impacted many other species. So they're a really great conservation comeback story, as we call it. Now, Minnesota having about the third largest breeding population of eagles throughout the US, with Canada and Alaska being, oh no, excuse me, with Alaska and Florida being before Minnesota for the US. Canada also having a very large breeding population for bald eagles. So they are true raptor. And so they're hunting on fish, small mammals, squirrels, rabbits, and need open water typically to survive. So a lot of our eagles will migrate ever so slightly. They might only be going down to portions of the Mississippi River or the Minnesota River, even within Minnesota, wherever there's still open water. You will find large congregations of eagles during the winter months, so that way they can still have access to fish as one of their main food sources. So, feeding habitats, fish during the late spring and summer, during their nesting season, when there's open water, as I mentioned. They will also hunt waterfowl and small mammals like rabbits and squirrels, and they'll eat food caught on their own. If they find it dead, they also may scavenge. And they will also steal food on occasion from other birds of prey. Ospreys were on the list, and that's likely another pretty big bird of prey that you probably have seen flying around your waterways, lakes, rivers, or streams. They also have a habit of scavenging off of deer carcasses. It could be roadkill, maybe that you see, or even gut piles that hunters leave behind. So we have a very intertwined interaction with our ecosystems and our wildlife, and some of the wildlife that may come and scavenge after hunters left a gut pile. Maybe they've taken a deer successfully. So lots of things come and feed on all different resources that we find on our public lands that we also interact with. And as I mentioned, the Raptor Center has fantastic information and does a lot of great work with the raptors throughout the Midwest and in Minnesota. They did note that the bald eagle is now their most common patient, with between 150 and 190 admitted every year. The clinic often receives bald eagles that collide with vehicles. They're shot or suffer from lead toxicity from ingesting deer carcasses and gut piles, or, there are always undetermined injuries as well. So those are some of our predators found in Anoka County. Talked about some mammals, we talked about some aquatic mammals, and we also talked about one of our most famous birds of prey, the bald eagle. And Gretchen, if there's time, I'd be happy to answer some questions if anybody has any.
Okay, thanks, Allie. Why don't people put their questions in the chat? That way we can, kind of keep things sorted out a little better. But I have a little question for you while we're waiting for people to put their questions in the chat. You talked about the bear and the coyotes and the bobcats having their babies come right around this time now. But so does everybody else, right? The deer and the bunnies and the skunks. And so if we're out in the woods and we find a baby animal, what do we do?
Fantastic question. So it's actually going to vary per species, like you mentioned. We can't generalize them all that much. However, one of our most common educational opportunities is to talk about fawn. So let's pretend all the snow is melted and maybe it is May. You might come across a fawn and they use the technique of hide and wait. So mom will be nearby that fawn. Our number one recommendation is do not touch it, leave it alone. It is very likely it is not abandoned. But because they are a prey species, being an herbivore, mom typically will leave their fawn somewhere nestled up next to a tree. I have walked up on a right past a fawn nestled up next to a tree on the WMAs in Anoka County and kept on going down the trail. And then I saw a doe nearby, likely its mom. So they are around and they are not abandoned. But because that young fawn cannot keep up with mom yet, they play the hide and wait game. So we never recommend touching any wildlife or removing them, even if they appear to be abandoned. It's very likely they are not. Young, like coyote pups or black bear cubs, will be denning with mom and they will be protected in a more confined space. So it's pretty common you won't come across young of those predatory species because they'll be closely associated with mom, and those species tend to den and they have young in the middle of winter versus in the spring when everything starts to bloom and lots of animals start to get up and moving. So our number one piece of advice is always leave wildlife where it is because that's the best chance it has for survival.
Thanks. We got one question. The question that I saw was, so is DNR working with the legislature to ban lead shot? I know that's been in the legislature for a bunch of years, but it keeps not happening. Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. It certainly is in the works, and there can be special regulations put in place on wildlife management areas. So while it hasn't been passed yet at the statewide level or in legislature yet, we do have the ability on occasion to write in specific Minnesota rules from our department that the commissioner will sign off on and authorize. So one example is in Washington County, where Keystone Woods WMA was just acquired back in 2024. Huge parcel for the public to gain access to that was previously privately owned as a cattle ranch. And lead ammunition is banned on that property. So we are allowed to make some of those rules implementations as new acquisitions come on. However, for the statewide banning, it will have to happen through the office of the legislature. So it's in progress. It's something we think a lot about, in federal waterfowl production areas. They also have their own restrictions. So some units have it, but it's not statewide yet.
And I suppose that doing it place by place is effective, at least for the animals in that place. So that's,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, especially out on Keystone Woods and many of our early projects going on out there for initial development. We were walking around seeing eagles' nests, eagles being very active. And so it's just a great example of almost 2,000 acres now that are protected right outside the metro area. So piece by piece, hopefully we continue to make those improvements.
thanks. We got a question about up at Cedar Creek, the pack of wolves that was at Cedar Creek. The question says, I know several years ago there was a pack of wolves that had to be destroyed because they were causing problems with wildlife. Is there any evidence of wolves moving back?
Great question. Yeah, and I had a picture on our mammalian carnivore slide there of a gray wolf because I absolutely love wolves. The known closest pack currently is actually over in Chisago County out of Wild River State Park, but they certainly have the ability to kind of traverse over into Anoka County. It's right on the edge there of that northeastern boundary of the county. We get many pictures and calls and sometimes video as well of what people think are a wolf sighting. However, I've only been in my wildlife role here for coming up on a year and a half, 2 years. We haven't had any wolf confirmations yet. They do always tend to be coyote, but it doesn't mean they're not around. Their population is expanding. And so I'm not sure if there have been any recent sightings on Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, but that's very close to our WMAs, like Carlos Avery WMA. And so providing more of that continuous habitat where their prey are located certainly could create more opportunities for them to be in the area. So all of our calls most recently have been confirmed as coyote, but the wolf population is not far away from Anoka County at all. So there absolutely can be one or more coming and going, trying to find these large open pockets of natural preserves.
I got a question about bears here. We have a fair number of black bears that are living in the area. Have there been problems with bird feeders being torn down? Again, in those reports?
Yes. Yep. That is a pretty common conflict with the bird feeders. Obviously, they see it as a nice, easy snack. Another one being conflicts with chicken coop. And so, whoever shared that comment, you're spot on. We have a healthy bear population in the area and in Anoka County, and we have them on all of our WMAs and other public and natural areas. They are finding resources. So, we can reference people to our wildlife damage program within my division of wildlife, and they can work together to try opportunities such as energized fencing, education materials, or damage assistance programs. Like if your apiary gets destroyed, your chicken coop by that black bear, you can try the electric fencing program that our division is running and researching. And they actually are working on publishing a paper that it's a very effective method to keep bears away. Once they touch it and find out that it's energized, they will not return. But it means you have to maintain an energized fence, and not everybody's always interested in that. So the easiest option when it's things like a wildlife feeder is just to take it out, remove it, put it inside, put it back out later in the season when there's more food abundant for the bears so they can go off and scavenge somewhere else.
Thanks. Got a question about ospreys. So I don't know if you know Anoka, but there's Sunny Acres Park is right in the city of Anoka, just north of Highway 10. And a pair of ospreys nested there on top of the lights in the soccer field. The ospreys weren't affected by the soccer games or traffic, and the neighborhood's always glad to see them come back in April. But when this pair dies, will other ospreys adopt the nest? And also, they have a question about the diet of ospreys.
Great question. Um, We see some species adapting to urban settlement better than others. Ospreys seem to be one I see often nesting on light posts or power lines and things that provide a nice big high up flat platform. So that's not uncommon to see. And clearly, as you noted, they're not disturbed by the activities going on below, which is perfectly fine. That's how a lot of wildlife adapt these days. Um, and there is potential for other birds to move into that nesting site once this pair moves on. It's also possible for the site or the nest to be adapted to a new species. We've seen crazier things like waterfowl taking on abandoned eagle nests. And so that seems like a pretty big hotel to move into and risky as well. But sometimes wildlife will evaluate the needs of that year and that season. If maybe an eagle likes that spot, they might make that nest bigger and take it on. Or another pair of ospreys could come through and see it as a good opportunity as well.
Thanks. The diet, what do they eat? I thought they were fish eaters.
Yeah, they certainly eat fish as well. It's pretty close diet, just like the eagles, so small mammals. So being
Okay.
near an open field is always a good option. They'll see something like a rabbit going by, a small chipmunk, things like that. Oftentimes they'll prey in those tall grass fields. So a soccer field kind of makes sense as well. And then they will also find food sources along aquatic water bodies, rivers, streams, and lakes too.
Okay, thanks. We have a question now about turkeys, which I know are not predators, but they are certainly a conservation success story. So you want to talk a little bit about turkeys? They can get aggressive. That was the question. In their areas, in my area, there's been problems with aggressive wild turkeys. And even if they're not aggressive, they sure don't move when you drive up at them. So
That's another great one. We do talk about turkeys all the time, as you mentioned, not a predatory species, but very abundant in Anoka County and throughout the metro. They are a protected species, and I think this comment alluded to it. They were almost extirpated from the state, and in the 70s, turkeys were reintroduced from Missouri. And since then, they have had success recolonizing and breeding and finding food sources as well as suitable habitat throughout the agricultural zone and smaller populations as you get further north into the more coniferous boreal forest. So they have made an immense comeback in our state. I believe we have some upcoming research on their population estimates. We currently do run a spring and a fall turkey season in the state, so they are harvested every single year. And again, very similar to coyote, when there are green spaces and protected spaces like parks and golf courses, they find food sources, they find roosting trees for going up into at night, and they breed and they increase their population. So this comment is something we get called about very regularly. Again, the seasonality of it will change. And so we might start to get calls in the spring. They flock up into really big groups. And then in the summer, when there's more food sources, they'll disperse out into people's farm fields and things like that. And we get called a lot about aggressive behavior. So they have a social hierarchy and a pecking order, if you will. And so if they have found that food source and think they're comfortable there, they'll continue to feed there, digging up grubs, seeds, and anything they can find. So we tell everybody it's very important to make them feel uncomfortable. You can honk your horn, you can spray them with a water hose, you can shoo them off your property, but you can't do anything lethal because they are a protected game species. So you can't hurt them, but we encourage people to shoo them off their property and try and make them move on to find a more suitable habitat because it's very common that they take up in large flocks in residential areas where there's lots of nice protected green space. And we
Yeah,
don't have any instances of turkeys injuring people. So they seem big and aggressive and they definitely can hold their ground, but we do encourage people in non-interest ways. Maybe you have a broom with you and you got to shoo them off your property. That way they know they have to move on to find a new food source.
a lacrosse racket works too.
Yes, absolutely.
So, got a question about mountain lions. So, occasionally we hear about a mountain lion in the area. Is there any chance they would decide that this would be the ideal place for them to live?
Another great question, and a species I didn't touch on in today's presentation because I felt like focusing time on our more abundant species and especially ones that have breeding populations. So that's the real distinction between mountain lions and cougars. That's the same common name. They do not, they are not known to have a breeding population in Minnesota. So all of our sightings are typically transient males looking for new territory or just traveling from one territory to another. So Minnesota tends to be that pass through state. We are able to verify sightings either with game cam footage, tracks in snow. Last winter, we did verify one down in Washington County. So they use open spaces, especially our large river corridors, to travel great distances. Typically, the closest breeding population in the state of Minnesota is found out west in the Black Hills of South Dakota. So it's not uncommon. It is rare, but they do not have a breeding population here. So we wouldn't consider them a resident species. But if it's a mountain lion, then it's a mountain lion. And they're typically big males coming through who don't stay for very long. And unfortunately, oftentimes they, may not make it out of the metro area with vehicle collisions being very common when they do find themselves down there.
Yeah, not a great idea to come here on foot. So, a question about, does DNR track wolves? Do you collar them and track them so you
Yes.
know where they are?
So, yep, the Forest Research Program have wolf research going on every single year, and they visit dens and they collar wolves, and they release a paper to us every single year, kind of talking about the estimated population for that given year. So they're researching their population as well as the Voyager Wolf Project. If anybody's heard of that, run through the National Park Service and a nonprofit. So kind of up in that northern boreal forest habitat where they're most abundant is where a lot of the research is going on. But our team is, studying that population for an estimate annually, as well as that growing and kind of changing range.
Yeah, so I know that I follow the Voyager Wolf Project on Facebook, and they have great footage that they put up from their trail cams. And I follow the DNR's Eagle Cam too, so there's a lot of resources through social media where we can keep an eye on wildlife. So thank you. I think our last question is going to be about chickens and predators of chickens. So someone in Oak Grove lost their chickens. Was it coyotes? Was it possums? I know ate mine because I encountered one in the chicken coop. Um, who else eats our chickens?
A lot of people. That's a lot of wildlife, I should
Yeah.
say. That's a great question. So we had numerous reports of bear breaking into chicken coop over the past summer, and then fox is probably the other most common that are going to get into your chicken coop and go for chicks and eggs. Raccoons would be another one. If they can get in there, they might go for some eggs.
Yeah, so it's good to have, a strong fence. That was my problem. I didn't have a lid on it. They just walked up the top and came down the side and ate my chickens. So,
Yeah, you absolutely want to secure them. That's what we try and tell everyone, especially
yeah.
once they have that first interaction with predatory wildlife. They'll likely try to come back and have some more. So we always recommend really securing them.
hmm Well, I want to thank you, Allie, for talking to us. I appreciate that very much. And you have your contact information, so we'll be able to reach out to you if we have additional questions. Can
Absolutely.
people come to Carlos Avery and drive through and look at things?
Yeah, great question, Gretchen. Carlos Avery, where my team and I are located, are actually considered a major unit within our department and division of Fish and Wildlife. So it's about 25,000 acres. We do have a portion in Anoka County. We also have a portion in Chisago County. But because it's a major unit on the Anoka County side, there are roads that can be driven through, which is pretty rare. For the most part, WMAs have only perimeter access on foot because it's preserved for natural wildlife habitat. But Carlos Avery, you can come through any of the gates off of Broadway or Viking Boulevard. If they're closed, it means that, storms come through or we just have some road maintenance going on. Otherwise, if they're open, they are open to the public and you are welcome to drive through.
And what kind of critters will we see if we go there?
Depends on the time of year. We do have a pretty big bird following. So lots of people will come through for maybe sandhill crane migration. They tend to migrate and stop in a lot of our wetland pools. We have a high pressure of waterfowl hunters who come through in the fall season. So you could see lots of different birds. We have numerous nesting eagles on site. I have seen a coyote, but that's pretty rare. They're pretty elusive. So squirrels, turkey are often present as well. So depending on the time of year, you might see some different kind of activity and you will almost definitely, I can almost guarantee you will at least see signs of beaver or beaver activity. You probably won't see one swimming around, but we have a very high population of beaver, and so you'll be able to see their lodges or even their dams in a lot of our wetlands.
Well, that sounds wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Allie, and we will let you get on with your day. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
Mhm.